With the injury retirement of Frank Ragnow, the Detroit Lions' three-time All-Pro center, the Lions have some work to do. The offensive line that has been a staple of the Detroit offense over the last 4 seasons could potentially be at risk of falling. The Great Wall of Detroit could potentially crumble if the Lions don't make the proper moves to secure it. And today we're going to take a look at what those moves look like, how the Detroit Lions can minimize the loss of Frank Ragnow, how they can maximize their potential for their new look offensive line in 2025, and just kind of the different ways they could assemble this offensive line to still give them strength and depth at different positions. So let's get into taking a look at it. But before we do, let's take a look at what the Lions were in the past and what this offensive line actually has to live up to. Over the last 4 years, the Detroit Lions have been phenomenal at pass blocking. In 2024, they ranked 10th in the NFL in sacks allowed. In 2023, they ranked 4th with just 31 sacks allowed. In 2022, they ranked 2nd in the NFL with 24 sacks allowed, and in 2021, they allowed 36 sacks for 14th in the NFL. The last time this offensive line was below average in sacks allowed was 2020, a year before the Matt Patricia reign came to an end. And ever since then, the offensive line in Detroit has been above average, if not elite, for the entirety of that time period. Now, of course, pass blocking isn't the only thing to look at, right? Run blocking is important as well. Now, there's a lot of statistics out there on grading run blocking and grading different players on the offensive line. In my opinion, yards per carry is a good metric because yes, the running backs certainly matter. The ability to create after contact certainly matters, but typically if your yards per carry is very good, your offensive line is pretty good. The best way you could put it is your offensive line sets the floor for your running game and your running back sets the ceiling. So if you have a good run blocking metric, if you have good yards per carry, you typically have a pretty good offensive line. And over the last 4 years, the Lions have done nothing but get better. In 2021, they had 4.4 yards per carry, 2022, 4.5, 2023, 4.6, and last year they saw a career high of 4.7. Every single year, they get just a little bit more efficient at running the football. And I think we've seen that, right? The first year, they really couldn't do it. They had Jamal Williams and they had DeAndre Swift, and they just didn't have that productive run game. The year after, Jamal Williams was a 1,000-yard rusher, and DeAndre Swift had over 800 rushing yards on the ground. The year after that, they went to David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs, both of whom were significantly better running backs. And then, of course, last year, Jahmyr Gibbs took another step forward. So the logical conclusion there is, yeah, the Lions would be better at running the football. And I think the offensive line from a run blocking perspective continues to get better. When they added Kevin Zeitler, it got better. When they moved on from a guy like Jonah Jackson, it got better. And every single year, they seem to add pieces that really improve the run blocking scheme. And I think that obviously Hank Fraley has a lot to do with that. Just the overall talent has a lot to do with that. And just in general, the Lions are a very talented front five. They are a great offensive line, both pass blocking and run blocking, and they have been that way for nearly half a decade at this point. With that being said, the last time the Detroit Lions were without Frank Ragnow was some of the darkest times in the Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes era. Last time the Lions were without Frank Ragnow was 2021, where he started the year and played 4 games before losing his season to injury, and they weren't very good. They went 3-13-1. They were 25th in the NFL in points scored and 22nd in yards gained as an offense. Jared Goff took 35 sacks, which is the most sacks he's taken in his entire career in Detroit. And of course, he got hurt that season as well. Without Frank Ragnow, the Detroit Lions have really struggled as an offensive line at times. They're far from a bad offensive line, but they don't look like the dominant unit we're used to seeing. The most recent example I could think of is last season or 2 seasons ago when they were in New Orleans. The Lions put up 21 points through the first quarter and a couple minutes. And then when Frank Ragnow went down in that second quarter, they only scored 10 points the rest of the game. Their signal caller, the guy that calls protections, the leader, and the captain of that offensive line lost the game, right? Was lost to the game due to injury. And the Lions offense suffered really severely because of that. I think that's why a lot of people are upset. I personally think that this loss is bigger to the Detroit Lions than losing Aaron Glenn. I think it's bigger to the Detroit Lions than losing even Ben Johnson, because Frank Ragnow was the starter on that line. He was the tone setter. He was the guy that had everybody ready, everybody lined up, everybody on the same page. He was in charge of communications and protections and calling out blitzes and so many different intricate parts of what made the Lions offensive line so technically refined. And to put that on somebody else and to put that kind of responsibility on potentially a rookie or a player that doesn't play that position very often is a big risk that the Detroit Lions are going to have to run. So who's going to possibly do that? Well, take a look at the offensive tackles, just because we'll do the entire offensive line in this video. There are 4 that will likely make the roster. Taylor Decker and Penei Sewell will start. Giovanni Manu and Dan Skipper will likely return as well. Dan Skipper's a little bit on the fence here. I think that Giovanni Manu takes a logical step forward from where he was a season ago. He could very well just be the backup tackle for both sides, and the Lions could live with that, leaving Dan Skipper off, but they also could keep both, much like they did a season ago. The guard position, you have obviously Christian Mahogany, who was fantastic last year. You have Tate Ratledge, who is supposed to be very good, was drafted in the 2nd round for a reason. Kayode Awashia has started games for the Detroit Lions in the past. I believe has 4 or 5 starts under his career, including an NFC Championship game appearance. Miles Frazier was drafted, talked about as one of the big steals of the draft for the Detroit Lions. Natane Moody was a player that got hurt in the preseason, but the Lions seemed incredibly high on throughout their process of the preseason last year. And Colby Sorsdale has made a couple starts for the Detroit Lions. While not being talked about as potentially a big name guy or a replacement level threat, he is a guy that, has started games. He started his first career game on Monday Night Football a few seasons ago, and he's had a few spot starts here and there. And even though he's not fantastic, he's far from a liability on the offensive line. In a worst case scenario, if you're at guard 6 or 7, you could do a lot worse than Colby Sorsdale, somebody who has started games, somebody that knows the system and has proven that in times of need, they can step up and put together good performances when the opportunity is called upon them. The center position is really where the Detroit Lions start to look weak. Graham Glasgow was the obvious choice to move over to center. There's going to be a lot of people that say, okay, Graham Glasgow has voiced his opinion of not liking to move around on the offensive line a lot. And I think that really applies more to midseason. I think it's much harder for an offensive lineman to just spot start at center when they've been practicing at guard all year or vice versa. I think if Graham Glasgow has an entire offseason to really practice at center, to really get comfortable at center and solidify in that spot, he could be much better than I think a lot of people expect. He's a guy that did play center in the past, has played center for the Detroit Lions, and even though he doesn't love moving around the offensive line, if you tell him, hey, you will be the center, this is your position for the entire season while you're healthy, I think he'd be more than willing to do it, to help the team, to get a starting role, and just continue to play football and help this team win. He's that type of player that will do it even if he doesn't love it. If the Lions need him to do it, I think he will step up to the plate. Kingsley Eguakun, an undrafted rookie free agent, I thought was pretty good in the preseason last year. Obviously showed why he was an undrafted rookie, but I thought also showed some flashes. He's a good player. He's got some athletic upside and could potentially be a long-term backup option, but I'm not sure you're ready to throw a second-year undrafted free agent into the starting lineup. It obviously worked with Jason Kelce for the Philadelphia Eagles, but not everybody can be Jason Kelce. He is a special type of player, and while Kingsley Eguakun certainly you could find similarities, he's not the same type of player. And Michael Neese is the same way. I thought he had some good moments in the preseason a year ago, but certainly not any moments where you would say, yeah, that player's a starter. That's the guy we want to replace Frank Ragnow, because quite frankly, they just aren't. And none of them will be. Nobody will replace Frank Ragnow. There isn't a player on the planet Earth right now that could replace what Frank Ragnow was for the Detroit Lions. But it's not really about replacing Frank at this point in the offseason, right? It's about minimizing the loss and maximizing what the Lions can get done with that front 5. The good news for the Detroit Lions is they have 7 players who have starting experience in the NFL. Obviously, Taylor Decker and Penei Sewell. Dan Skipper has made a couple starts under the Dan Campbell era. It hasn't happened in a couple years, but he did start the very first game of the Dan Campbell era and a couple games in between. Christian Mahogany started 2 games a season ago, including the divisional round playoff game. Kayode Awashia has started in the NFC Championship for the Detroit Lions. Colby Sorsdale has started on a couple of games, including primetime football on Monday night as a rookie. And Graham Glasgow has started a lot of games throughout his NFL career. Mixed in with that group, those 7 players, that is 2 or 3 tackles, that is 3 interior offensive linemen, and of course, Graham Glasgow, who could play center. Some of the players that, of course, have yet to make a start include the rookies of Tate Ratledge and Miles Frazier, both of whom were drafted very high for a reason and projected to be day 2 picks for a reason as plug-and-play starters. And despite the Lions losing maybe their best offensive lineman on the team, I still think there are a number of lineups that they could throw out there that make a lot of sense for Detroit. My projected lineup is as such: Taylor Decker at left tackle, Christian Mahogany at left guard, Graham Glasgow at center, Tate Ratledge at right guard, and Penei Sewell at right tackle. The tackles are pretty self-explanatory. Christian Mahogany started at left guard against Chicago in the regular season and was quite good. Good run blocker, good pass blocker. He filled in at right guard in the playoffs because they just needed him to do it. They needed a player. He was by far the best option. I think he's more naturally a left guard. He played very well at that position, and that allows a player like Tate Ratledge to be more comfortable at right guard, where he played in college, had the ability, and can just kind of plug and play like the Lions expected him to do coming out of the draft. I think this is the Lions' best front five as far as talent goes. I think everybody has a natural fit. Everybody has played this position and played those positions before. Everybody will be comfortable. And even though there will certainly be some growing pains from communication and just overall playing with the new lineup, I think this is probably the best option for the Lions if they were to throw somebody out today, if they were to play tomorrow. I think this is the line that they would put out there. Should there be injuries, potentially to Graham Glasgow or to one of the guards, this is what I think the rotation could look like. The tackles stay the same, but I think Miles Frazier has the experience and the ability to start at left guard if they're in a pinch. Tate Ratledge is already taking snaps with first-team centers at rookie minicamp and throughout OTAs, and Christian Mahogany, of course, as shown a season ago, is more than capable to play the right guard position. So an offensive line due to injury could look like Taylor Decker, Miles Frazier, Tate Ratledge, Christian Mahogany, and Penei Sewell. Another potential lineup change could be Taylor Decker, Coyote Owashia, Tate Ratledge at center, Christian Mahogany at right guard, and Penei Sewell at right tackle. You could potentially move a couple other players around as well, but I do think there's enough depth to keep this thing going. I think there's enough depth to keep the ship afloat, and I don't think it's going to be the biggest concern for the Detroit Lions. Obviously, losing Frank Ragnow is not good. Losing Frank Ragnow is really tough for the Detroit Lions to have to go through, but I do think there is some semblance of not only talent to start the season, but depth if injuries are to occur. Now, it's not perfect. There's a lot of young players in that role. Christian Mahogany is a second-year player. Tate Ratledge is a rookie. Miles Frazier is a rookie. Coyote Owashia doesn't have a ton of starting experience. Graham Glasgow doesn't have a ton of recent starting experience as a center. So there are some issues with this plan, and there are some issues that the Lions are going to have to deal with. But at the end of the day, there are worse offensive lines in the NFL than any of these three lineups. And if we go back to the first one, right, with Taylor Decker and Christian Mahogany and Graham Glasgow, Tate Ratledge, and Penei Sewell, I still very firmly believe that is easily a top 10 and probably even still a top 5 offensive line in football. You have two starting tackles that are well above average, including the best tackle, maybe the best offensive lineman in football. Christian Mahogany showed a ton of promise a season ago. Graham Glasgow is a veteran starter. And Tate Ratledge is somebody that even, certain analysts put in a top 40 prospect. Some people had him as early as a potential first-round pick out of Georgia. He should be a plug-and-play starter absolutely immediately. This is an offensive line that should still absolutely be able to run block, an offensive line that should still be able to pass block well enough to get Jared Goff time to distribute the ball. And I see no reason that this offensive line can't make things happen in the NFL. And if injuries arise, if a guard goes down, if a tackle goes down, I still really do trust the depth because they have Tate Ratledge, they have Miles Frazier, they have Coyote Owashia, they have Colby Sorsdale, they have Netane Moody, who they really like. They have some depth at the offensive line position. Frank Ragnow certainly hurts that, and it isn't a good or ideal scenario, but he is a quality player, and they have quality players left. There are a couple of outside-the-box options I wanted to mention. Giovanni Manu moving to guard is a potential. We talked about that maybe a couple months ago. And while the offensive line coaches and Hank Fraley and some of the other coaches have said, we really want, him to focus at tackle, with this being moved, and if injuries just happen to go that way, having somebody of his size, having somebody that's 6'8", 330 pounds that moves like Giovanni Manu moves, could just be something they have to do to make sure they continue to run the ball well. It's worked for the Philadelphia Eagles with several different players, including Jordan Mailata. At the end of the day, size, athleticism, and power usually win you a spot at guard. And if it is a really desperate situation, I think the Lions could move to it and just kind of learn to live with it for the time being. I think Brandon Scherf is still a good option out of free agency. Yes, he's old. Yes, he's a bit of a glass cannon, but you can't deny that if he is on the team, the offensive line and specifically the depth looks much better. David Andrews, the center from New England, played 4 games a season ago, is still playing at a fairly high level. Is he Frank Ragnow? Absolutely not, but he is a veteran center, knows how to call protections, knows how to lead a locker room, knows how to lead an offensive line, and from there is a pretty good player. And then Will Hernandez, a player that a lot of Lions fans really talked about throughout the offseason, is still available as well. He could be just a depth option at guard as well, move some people around. You obviously lose Graham Glasgow at guard, so you add one more veteran player in Will Hernandez or Brandon Scherf or, whatever the case may be. The bottom line is there isn't a way to replace Frank Ragnow. The only thing the Lions can do is minimize the loss. The only thing they can do is live with what has happened and continue to play good football. And with that being said, I hope this video helped you see that they can still do that. That even though Frank Ragnow is going to be a loss, even though the Lions are certainly going to feel that loss, they should be okay. They are a good offensive line still. They are certainly still a top 10 unit, probably even still a top 5 unit. And at the end of the day, they will continue to be the life. They will continue to be the heartbeat of this Detroit Lions offense because they set the tone. And as good as this offensive line is as good as the offense can be. So that being said, that's all I got for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below your opinions on the offensive line lineup. Let me know from left tackle to right tackle what your starting 5 would be. I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments down below. With all that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.